technical assistance. And I've also worked with the U.S. Department of Transportation, with the Washington, D.C. Metro, and with the Ohio Department of Transportation. So I've got transit experience in a lot of different avenues, but it's great to be here giving this webinar with you this morning. John?
Thank you, Nancy. John Carillo, similar experience with FTA that Nancy has. Been doing triennial reviews, state management reviews for over 25 years, since I was a very young child, obviously. Also conducted numerous triennial review workshops and state management review workshops as well. I'm happy to be here to help on the first RIR webinar. We're excited to present this. It's a very good idea. I got my start. Oh, well, you switched the slide before I was.
That's it. Too bad about your
too
start.
Bad. Forget where I got started. I got started at FTA in the Region 3 Philadelphia office, both as a community planner and as a general engineer.
All right, ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, so welcome to the webinar again. What we'd like you to do is please download the documents that are attached there in the webinar screen. The documents include a copy of the slides that we're going to be going through today, a copy of the draft FY 2020 Contractor's Manual, formerly known as the Comprehensive Review Guide, before that known as the Workshop Workbook, but we're calling it the Contractor Manual this year, so you can download that. And it's a great tool that we hope you'll be using throughout the webinar and going forward with your RIR preparation. Also, there's a blank copy of an RIR for those of you who might not know exactly what's included in the RIR. The purpose of the webinar is to provide some advice for you on getting your responses back to FTA in a complete and timely way so that you can begin working with your reviewer to prepare for your site visit. This is not a substitute for one of the workshops. The workshops are a 2-day intensive training on all of the requirements. We're not going to talk about all of the requirements. We're just really going to focus on the documents you need to send in. You can ask questions throughout the webinar by typing them into your screen, and we will compile all those questions and address them at the end to the extent there's time available. Also, they'll be included in the transcript. Also, we want to just make sure you're aware that closed captioning is available. If you follow the link in the chat box, you can view this presentation with closed captioning. If you have any additional questions when we're finished, please direct them to your lead reviewer, and you can always direct questions to your FTA regional office. Another thing that is going to be new in the webinar is we're going to pop up questions throughout that we want you to respond to immediately. So every time we get to one of those questions, we'll highlight it, we'll take a quick break, and we ask you to quickly respond. And again, closed captioning is available for those if you follow the link to view the closed captioning. So the triennial review process has a lot of steps. Right now we're at the beginning there in the RIR stage. The response to your RIR is due on the date that was included in the cover letter. The dates vary a little bit depending on when the regional offices sent those letters out, but please respond to those RIR deadlines in a timely way. You can always update or make changes throughout the process, but don't wait if there's something you're still working on. Get everything in on time to the extent you have it available. If you've had a review in 2017, you probably recognize that the RIR this year is different from the GIR. It was called at that time the Grantee Information Request. You're not grantees anymore, now you're recipients, so now it's an RIR. So you might remember that that document was quite a bit larger. John actually counted up the pages, and the 2017 GIR had 188 pages. The RIR this year is only 66. The difference is the GIR at that time included all the questions that are in the Contractor's Manual. We no longer want you to answer all those questions. I mean, it's great if you want to, go right ahead, but instead the reviewers are going to be looking at the documents you submit and answering those questions. So we still need all of that information, but the way we get it is a little different. Rather than having you fill out the answers, we're going to look at your documents and then we'll get back to you with follow-up questions. The real purpose here, though, is to make sure that the reviewer has the information needed to begin planning for the site visit. It allows for a much smoother review if you give us accurate and timely information, and we can identify minor issues ahead of time and try to iron those out. We'll have a lot of what we're calling RIR tips as we go through, so you'll see them on the screens and then you'll see them again as we go through each of the review areas. I'm just going to highlight briefly that even though the questions are not in the RIR, we still need to answer them, so we really recommend that you use the Contractor's Manual as a tool as you're completing the RIR. Look at the questions, look at the indicators of compliance, make sure the documents you're submitting answer those questions. This will help you understand exactly what the reviewers need. We always say the triennial review is an open book test, so you use that Contractor Manual, you'll see every question. It's basically the test you have to follow, and we will be using all those same questions. And then look carefully at also follow-up information. In the RIR, there's the documents that are requested right now, but then also in the Contractor's Manual, it identifies follow-up documents. If you notice those follow-up documents apply to you, go ahead and submit them as well. If you upload a document, indicate where in the document the reviewers can find the necessary information. We're going to hit on that point again and again. Upload searchable documents. That's a very important point you're going to hear us mention repeatedly. And if you don't have a written policy or procedure when it's requested, please explain how you adhere to those requirements. It's not always necessary or required that you have a written policy, but if you do, it gives us a good explanation of how your agency operates. If you don't, then use the comment box or add additional information explaining how you follow the requirements or execute the process that's being asked about. Try to be very accurate. We really need accurate information about your facilities, your equipment, your contractors, your subrecipients. John's going to talk quite a bit more about that. Use the comment box. We'll show you some examples of a good use of the comment boxes. And as we repeatedly say, contact your reviewer if you have questions. Don't be afraid to call your reviewer and ask for clarification. Explain what you have. Ask, is that what you really need? Do you need something else? Get a rapport going with your reviewer early on, and it'll make the review much smoother. One other tip is for website links. You can always upload links to your website or to your MPO website for documents that are available there, rather than downloading public participation plans or your rider guide or large documents. We can always get them directly from your web links. If you've updated something after you've submitted the RIR, and again, we'll talk about this repeatedly, you can always submit additional information to your reviewer. So if something's in the process of being updated right now, don't feel like you need to wait. Go ahead, submit the document, but just indicate it's being revised. We'll talk about that more as we get into specific areas. And just also date the documents. Don't send us something, a policy or procedure with no date. We have no idea when it was last revised. If it's dated, then it's much more clear to us that it reflects current requirements. So here's our first question. We're going to take a quick break. We'd like you to answer on the screen this question: how many triennial reviews have you previously participated in? So go ahead and answer that question, and we'll be back with you in a few seconds.
Welcome back. Thank you for answering those questions. So we're going to start going through the three sections of the RIR. Section A, Operations Profile. Section B, the RIR itself, Request for Documents and Information. And then C is the Site Visit Agenda. The Operations Profile is very, very important. to inform your reviewer about your system, your services. It should be current, up to date. We strongly discourage taking the one you completed 3 years ago in 2017 and just submitting that one again. Take a look at it, update it. It's very important because it directly relates to what's going to be applicable in terms of review areas and questions to your triennial review. So we strongly encourage that it reflect your system as of the date of your submission. So the recipient profile, section A, has 5 tables. Operations profile we'll get into in a second. Everyone fills that out. Table 2 we will not discuss, and that's for states only. We're not discussing state requirements per se in this webinar. Section 3, subrecipient facilities, if applicable, if you have subrecipients, and we'll talk about that in a second. Award activity and contact information. Okay, so describe your agency, make sure it's accurate, because it directly affects the applicable review areas and the applicable questions that are in the contractor's manual that we will be reviewing with you as part of your review. Here is a screenshot of an example of table 1 being filled out, your operations profile. And make sure that the information that is in your operations profile is consistent with the information you submit in the review areas themselves, such as a list of vehicles in your satisfactory continuing control and other supporting documentation. So we've seen where information that's in your operations profile is not the same as information submitted elsewhere. So you want to make sure it's consistent with your other supporting documents. So let's go through this for a second, some general information about yourself, and then we ask about your subrecipients if you have subrecipients. So subrecipients are other public bodies. This is general. I'm just going to give a general definition and the differences between subrecipients and contractors. Other public bodies, private nonprofits, through who you pass FTA funds to. So contractors are private, for-profit entities, which also you provide funds through that provide a service. Subrecipients, you have interagency agreements. Contractors, you have formal legal contracts. So there's a difference between the two. You need to identify all those that have roles in your operation, including those that do not receive FTA funds, but are providing services to you, be that a subrecipient, other public agency, private agency. And when we talk about ADA, the importance of non-FTA funded supporting players will come out, because ADA applies to all your operation, whether it's FTA funded or not. But right now, list your subrecipients, list the source of funds that they receive. Is it 5307, 5310, 5339? And for your contractors, list all your operating and maintenance contractors, the name, and it's all helpful in parentheses to put what their role is. Any subcontractors as well that have safety sensitive employees should be identified. Any taxi cab companies or transportation network companies, Lyft, Uber, for which you have contracts with, explain that as well. Use this part to really describe all the players in your system. You can always attach a Word document to the operations profile or any of the sections as we go through it to provide more information for your reviewer. So you need to transfer a lot of information about your system to the reviewer. This is the first formal step in doing it. Use it, because the more information you can provide the reviewer, the smoother the review is, and the better the review will be, resulting in fewer findings and less of a fire drill at the site visit. And if you've gone through a site visit, you know that they can be a fire drill. So provide all that information. The table below in terms of rolling stock, you should be familiar with if you were involved 3 years ago. So self-explanatory, but there's a new little wrinkle here in the last column on the right there under number of vehicles / vessels, and that's federal interest. If the first two columns are the same as before, vehicles that have that were acquired through with FTA funds, federally funded, then locally funded vehicles, and then the third column, federal interest. Do you have any locally funded vehicles or vessels that have been overhauled, rehabbed, or some other major improvement with FTA funds? Because once you do that, then that asset, that vehicle, has a FTA interest. So right now, we're just asking yes or no whether you have any such rolling stock. And if you do say yes, that will trigger your reviewer, some questions from your reviewer once they see that yes there. But right now, we're not looking for vehicles, the numbers, number of vehicles, what part of your fleet have a federal interest, or what part of your fleet was locally funded but overhauled, rehabbed with FTA funds. So that's a new column there, so I wanted to spend a second or two on that. This is a continuation of table 1. You'll see this again, we asked 3 years ago for span of service. Make sure you're giving us the start and end times for all your modes individually. Don't give just total number of hours of service. You'll see that if you have other modes such as commuter, bus, whatever, add additional columns to this table. It's a Word document, easily can be modified, but put in for all your modes. Facilities, this is similar to 3 years ago. We asked you list all your facilities involved in your system, whether there's a federal interest or not. Again, was it acquired or major improvements with using FTA funds? Then it becomes a federal interest, and the address as well. List all the addresses of all your facilities. Again, if you need more room, either expand the table or add a Word document to the operations profile. For ferry systems, you should list all your facilities, docks, piers, even if not FTA funded, because again, the ADA requirements will apply to those facilities. So all the facilities in your ferry system should be listed in this table. Table 2 is states. We're not going to talk about that today. Table 3, subrecipient facilities, or facilities that have been constructed or renovated using FTA funds. And it's self-explanatory, the data items that we need, data elements that we need for this in this table. And then award activity. Indicate for both the first box there are projects that have been completed since the last review. Center box is ongoing projects. And third are projects planned in the future. For all these projects, indicate what are FTA funded and what are locally funded. Take credit for completed projects. Every year I see agencies not listing all their completed projects, and we really encourage you to do that. We'll know what's completed by looking at your milestone progress reports, but tell us, show us all the good things you've done. This information ultimately ends up in your triennial review report, and so make yourself look good. Be proud of what you did. For future projects, please note any new projects or new to your agency. So we've never procured electric powered vehicles before. Note that this is our first time of doing that. Or we've never constructed a downtown transit facility before. We're anticipating doing that, but obviously a major construction project is difficult. They're all difficult no matter how they start out. So inform the reviewer and FTA about anything in the future that'll be new or difficult. And we could talk about that at the site visit, because obviously this is a compliance review, but we always say we always provide technical assistance as well throughout the entire process. And the last table is contact information. Now we have some contact information, obviously, the head of your organization, the transit director, the GM, the CEO, but also provide to us the ultimate decision maker contact information as well for the final report. That could be the chair of the board, the mayor, or the commissioner or the county commissioner, whoever that is. So provide that information as well. Now we know it'll be at least 6 months before we produce a triennial review report, and that information may change and your reviewer will confirm it. But right now, give us the contact information of the supreme decision maker for your organization and or system. Section B is the RIR, Recipient Information Request. 90% of that, I would say, is document requests, but there also is information that you can provide. As I said earlier, the more you can provide earlier in the process, the smoother and more productive the process will be. We will go over 20 of the 21 RIR general topics, or the Triennial Review general topics as well. We'll not be discussing 5311, which is the formula program for rural areas, which are handled by states. So we'll go through what documents and information you should be submitting as part of the RIR for all 20 areas. Again, you'll see that, as Nancy said before, if you have one document that's going to be used for the document request in different locations, identify, you don't have to resubmit the document every time, but just identify where in that document the applicable information is. And if no document is submitted, say why. Sometimes the NA, not applicable, is self-evident, but a lot of times it's not. And if it's not self-evident, use that column table, that comment column, I got that right, the comment column to describe why it's not applicable. And Nancy and I cannot stress enough the importance of filling out that column. I believe it's underutilized, and it can give a lot of direction to your reviewer and answer a lot of their questions that they have looking at the submission. This is as part of your RIR cover letter. It's how you're going to have your folder filing naming convention by review area to financial management and capacity, and then A, B, C, D, et cetera, et cetera. Label your files. Okay, so by looking at the file name, you'll know what file, what document request it relates to. Contact your lead reviewer to determine how you're going to be submitting the RIR. The old days of big boxes of paper are done. No. And Nancy's telling me the old days of flash drives are done too. But some contractors use Dropbox, others have their own FTP sites. Contact them. Find out how you're going to be accessing or how you're going to be uploading the information to them, and do a dry run. Don't wait the day before or even the week before, but do a dry run, load some documents into that so you know how to use this new file loading system. As with all new systems, it takes a while to learn how to use it. So don't wait till the end to use it. But contact them. Hopefully they've already contacted you on how to load the RIR documents. Do a test run. Okay, there's question number 2. What is your primary focus in this upcoming triennial review? Civil rights, procurement, maintenance, transit asset management, and that's a new one that Nancy will talk about later. Satisfactory control, 3. 4, financial management, technical capacity, or other. So take a couple moments and do that, and we'll be right back. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back. Now John and I are going to take turns going through all of the areas of the RIR that we're going to cover today. So that's 20 out of the 21. On each of the slides, you'll see that we list the requested documents. This comes right from your RIR form itself. And then we have examples or additional questions. We're not going to go through every single bulleted item because we really just don't have time to talk about every single one. But what we want to highlight are things that are new or that we know from examples in the past can be problematic. And we'll hit those tips again, the RIR tips. Legal is usually an area that doesn't cause many issues for most recipients. What we're asking for here is if you have had any litigation claims, criminal violations, lobbying, that you identify that information. If you have used lobbying funds, then you submit the LLL forms and examples of any correspondence with FTA about litigation. But for most recipients, the answer to all of these questions are no. So what we'll see here on the example form is XYZ Transit saying that none of these areas are applicable. So they've used the comment column very helpfully and explained to us that it's not applicable because they haven't had litigation or defaults or disputes or any false claims, and they're not engaging in lobbying. The one other thing we want to mention, and it's not on this example, but we do encourage you to use that date column. That should be the date that you uploaded the document. So that's what we're looking for there. We don't expect you to upload everything all at once the day before it's due. Go ahead and start uploading documents as they're ready and put that date. It's also helpful for us if you update or change something, then we can see the change. If you date your documents and the date it's submitted is included there. So this example shows a good use of the comment boxes and explains why the files weren't submitted. That's a practice we'd like to see in all the areas. Moving on, financial management and capacity. Now in this case, I've got 3 slides of bullets with the required documents. There are a lot of documents we ask for in this area. Most of them are familiar. They're not anything that's new or different from your last review, except in a few cases. And the first one I want to highlight is when we ask for your financial policies and procedures as a result of requirements that were enacted with the uniform guidance, which is 2 CFR 200. It took effect December 26, 2014. But as a result of the new uniform guidance, there is a requirement that you have written financial policies that address cash management and allowability or eligibility of costs. So we recommend, and in most cases, you have financial policies that address well more than that. But at a very minimum, you have to have that in writing. When you submit your financial policies and procedures, make sure you highlight for the reviewer so they can find where those written aspects are included. Some of these items, like the Cash Management Improvement Act, apply only to the states. It's typical that documents that you submit may respond to several of these bullet items, and that's fine too. Let's highlight maybe the organization charts and the resumes will help the reviewers determine if your officials have the necessary expertise, if there's adequate supervisory control. In 2017, you might remember we had a table in the RIR where we asked you to list your financial officials and their credentials. So instead of that table now, we're asking you to just send organization charts, resumes, job descriptions, and we'll look to see what credentials are in there. We're going to pull a federal financial report, an FFR, from TRAMS, and we will be comparing that to the data in your financial systems to ensure that you are including all the required information. That's highlighted there in the second bullet. Again, from the uniform guidance, all of those categories of information need to be in your financial system in some place. So we're going to look for that, and we want to see how you are tracking and how that data gets into the FFR to make sure it's all consistent. We'll be looking for variance reports. We'll be looking for how you develop your budget projections, how you make adjustments to budgets as necessary. So depending on your financial system, several of these bullets, as I said, may be addressed by a single or a variety of different documents. Just make sure your reviewer can figure out where to find information needed. Financial is one of the areas where I think it's really most important that you look at all the questions and you look at the indicators of compliance and you make sure that we can get those answers. Because if you're a system that's, for instance, part of a transit department in a county or a large city, if you send us procedures that are countywide or citywide, we may not be able to find the aspects that are applicable to the questions we're asking. So work with your financial staff, make sure that all of those questions and indicators of compliance are clear. This is one area where a lot of systems find as a training tool, it's helpful to actually write out the answers, at least internally, so you're prepared to discuss them with us when we get on site. There is one question included in the financial capacity, management and capacity section. We ask you to describe in a narrative way your budget development process. This is specifically tied to question 7 in the Contractor's Manual. So we just found as a result of the documents, it was hard for reviewers to be able to actually get a handle on your budget process. So include a narrative description for us there, or if you have another document that answers that question, submit that. So again, the tips and the highlights: use the indicators of compliance, make sure the documents are searchable, particularly if they're large PDFs. If we can use the search function and find what we're looking for, it makes things a lot easier for us. We need written financial procedures for cash management and allowability of costs. This is new from the uniform guidance. And we'll be looking at your organization charts, the resumes, and job descriptions to ensure people have the right qualifications. So John's going to talk us through technical capacity next.
Thank you, Nancy. Technical capacity has been reorganized from 3 years ago. 3 years ago, you had one technical capacity review area. I think it was over 70 questions. But appropriately, FTA has split up now technical capacity to the 3 main elements of technical capacity. Your awards. So as Nancy said, you're no longer a grantee or a recipient. Same here. You no longer have grants. You have awards. So the whole terminology has changed, and it's a challenge to remember if you've been, for us as instructors at workshops, to make sure we have the right terminology. So how you are managing your awards, and then second, how are you managing your programs? And that is the programs where you have subrecipients carrying out part of those services underneath those programs. And then how are you managing your projects? So all that was together before, now it's separated. Now for award management, the first of the 3 technical capacity ones, primarily the reviewers were relying on information in Transit Awards Management System. And that would be your MPRs, your Milestone Progress Reports, and your Federal Financial Reports, or your FFRs. However, we will be asking for these, in addition to that information, these 2 documents. Now, unlike financial procedures, as Nancy said, as a result of the uniform guidance, there's 2 aspects of your financial procedures have to be written. There's no strict requirement that your awards management and reporting procedures be written. It is recommended as a good practice that you have these procedures so you really are very clear to your staff as to what needs to be done in your awards from FTA, from execution all the way to closeout, but they're not required to be written. But if you have such procedures, and even if they say grant management procedures, you do not need to change that wording. Submit those as well. The second piece of information is closeout schedule for all open awards. So what I would recommend is if any of your updated dates for your closeout schedule that go beyond the period of performance dates that is shown in the trams for that award, any of those dates have been extended, explain to your reviewer why. Your reviewer will take the closeout schedule, compare it to the period of performance information, and they will notice that it's late and start to ask you questions. Get ahead of that process for a lot of these things and explain why it's going to be later than either the period of performance or for the old, and for us old timers, team awards, the latest milestone date in your milestone progress report, your closeout dates in a milestone progress report. If it's going to be later than what the information is in trams, explain it to your reviewer. Now we also have a question here in awards management. If you do not have a written awards management and reporting procedure, describe how you do that, okay? Especially the development of your annual program of projects, making awards to subrecipients, and how do you close out awards, both for yourself and for your subrecipients. The second of the three technical capacity review areas is program management and subrecipient oversight. Now, the first two bullet points on the left side of this slide apply to states only, but the others all apply to recipients that have subrecipients, be they 5307 subrecipients, 5310 subrecipients, or 5339 subrecipients. So again, this area may not apply to you in your operation. If it does not, explain why. We, NA, and then in the comments column say, because we do not have any subrecipients. So you don't need to repeat that for all these data items, but be clear with your reviewer why this review area either applies or doesn't apply, either for any of them or for only certain questions. What I want to highlight here again, like Nancy said, we're not going to talk about all the points, but the subrecipient agreements, as a result of the uniform guidance, the information that needs to be included in those agreements has changed. So if you're using a template, an agreement template that's several years old, it may not be in conformance with uniform guidance. Go to the Contractor Manual. It'll tell you the elements that need to be included in those agreements. And if your current agreements do not include those information items, start to revise your subrecipient agreement. Submit your current agreement, and then note in the column, in the comment column, that you're in the process of reviewing it. And once it's reviewed, a template, a model will be sent to your reviewer. And that's a good tip that Nancy had mentioned earlier. If you're in process, if you, by putting together your RIR, realize that any of your documents, your policies and procedures are not fully compliant, submit them, because you don't have much time, but note it to the reviewer that you're in the process of updating it, and once updated, it will be resubmitted to the reviewer. The other thing here is implementation of your oversight procedures. So that you'll see on the right-hand column there, the second one down talks about oversight procedures. And we ask for oversight procedures in almost every review area, if you have subrecipients and or contractors. Here we're talking about what your oversight procedures are for your subrecipients. So that's your plan procedures. And then the last bullet there, lower right-hand corner, is documentation of implementing those procedures as well. What I always say at workshops, we're asking the RIR for your policies and procedures, or say what you do. And then part of our task is to find out the implementation of those policies or procedures, or confirm that you're doing what you say. And this last one is basically showing us that you're doing what you're saying by sample documentation. If you are passing through funds for 5310 or 5339, you have what's called a program management plan. Make sure the most recent one, the latest one, is loaded on the trams. If not, submit that to your reviewer and make sure, obviously, that's dated. So the third part of technical capacity is your projects. Obviously, if the projects aren't moving ahead, the awards are not being closed. So all three in your programs are not being implemented correctly. All three of the technical capacity areas are related. So first thing we ask for here is a list of FTA-funded capital projects undertaken during the past 3 years. We always get the question, what is the triennial review period? We generally say, and there are exceptions to every rule, don't you hate that answer? It depends. But generally, from the end of your last site visit to your projected in 2017 to your projected site visit in 2020. So list all your capital projects that were undertaken through that review period, including those that were undertaken using force account labor or a capital project completed that's normally completed by third-party contractors that you decided to use your own forces to complete. The typical one that we see all the time are rail properties working on the rail lines with their own forces versus a third-party contractor. Submit any project management procedures you have either in a project management plan or PMP, quality control plan. Give us examples of how you're implementing your project management procedures, copies of minutes of meetings, reports from the contractors, also site visits, documentation of site visits as well. One thing I'd like to, well, let me finish on the documentation request. And the last is any sample contracts you have with taxi companies or transportation network companies such as Ubers and Lyfts. Submit those as well. One thing, if you read the Contractor's Manual, it talks about delayed projects. So rather than waiting until you get to the site visit to discuss this, if you have any projects that have been, the subjective term, significantly delayed, start to explain to your reviewer, use this as opportunity to begin that, as I said, attach it in a different document. What projects have been significantly delayed and why, and what corrective actions you've taken. So we're going to be asking for that information. It's good to get a jump start on discussing these delayed projects. You determine if it's been significantly delayed or not, and then the reviewer, by reviewing the milestone progress reports, will be seeing indications of that as well. So again, the earlier you can start these discussions on these issues, the better for the entire review. Use the RIR mechanism to start that discussion. Here's an example of how to fill out the RIR for in this area. You see the document request, applicability, very important column, date submitted, Nancy explained that, electronic file name, and then comments as well. So as I said before, identify any delayed projects, and if you have force account plans over a certain dollar threshold, they need to be submitted to FTA. You don't need to submit the plan because FTA is taking the lead in that and the review of the plan, but send us a copy of the email to confirm, to document that it was submitted to FTA. Okay, question number 3, which is a simple yes or no. Are you planning on attending an FTA-sponsored workshop? There have been a couple workshops already given. The workshop season has started. 'Tis the season of FTA Triennial Review workshops. Nancy and I are both on the road next week doing some. So are you planning on attending one either at the end of 2019 or in 2020? Yes or no? Thank you. Be right back.
Okay, welcome back. Next, we're going to talk about TAM, Transit Asset Management. This is a new area. We started asking about it in the reviews in 2019. You had to submit prepare your TAM report in 2018. So going forward in the reviews, we're going to include this as an area. We're not reviewing your TAM plan in a substantive way. We're just reviewing it to ensure that it's complete because this is your plan, it's your working document. We will look at the plan, and FTA has asked us to verify that it includes all the required elements. So that's what's in the first bullet there, that the TAM plan includes all the elements that are required by the rule. We also ask you to submit your NTD target reports. Those are the reports that are included in the National Transit Database report on your performance targets for your assets and facilities and rolling stock. We can't look at that unless you give it to us. We don't have access to NTD. We will be looking for several other elements here and that verify that your accountable executive has the necessary authority. So we want the job description and the duties of the accountable executive. That person has to be authorized to control the resources that are available for your asset management system and the personnel involved. You also have obligations to submit the TAM plan to the states and MPOs, and then providing them the annual condition assessment reports. So we'll look for some documentation that you've submitted that information. Typically what we see there is an email. So we don't need to see the actual documents, but we want to see an email that you've submitted that information to the state and MPO as required. If you are a 5307 recipient with subrecipients who are not independently 5307, but 5311 or something, or 50 for the states, or 5339 or 5310, you need to give them an opportunity to participate in a group plan. So unless they've opted out, they should be included in your group plan. We need notification from the accountable executives for all the group plan participants that they have approved the group plan. So we're just checking the boxes here in TAM that all of the regulatory requirements have been met. Otherwise, the TAM plan is really a tool for you to use, so we're not getting into evaluating the substance of it, but we want to make sure you've included all the required elements. Look at the contractor manual. Again, in all of these areas, but particularly here in TAM, there's very detailed information about what all the requirements are under every question. In several areas, there's check boxes and tables that we will be filling out. So look at those, make sure that the information we're requesting is in your TAM plan. Ensure that the documentation of the TAM plan approval from the accountable executive is provided. There's no specific signature required. If you look at the FAQs on the FTA website, it clearly says that you don't have to have a sign off on the document, but whatever is your internal process for document approval, such as an email or a memo, or if you send everything to the board, a board resolution, whatever is your process is what we want to see documentation of for TAM. For satisfactory continuing control, we do have a couple of things that might be new to you from 2017 as a result of the uniform guidance. The first thing I want to highlight is there are different requirements for real property records depending on whether or not the real property was acquired before or after the effective date of the uniform guidance, which was December 26, 2014. So that's why you'll see in the RIR a list of elements that we're asking for real property purchased before that effective date and real property purchased after that effective date. It might, if you don't look carefully, it might be confusing to you because you'll think we're asking for the same thing twice, but it's depending on when you purchased the property. So make sure that you're aware of the acquisition date and the time of the award that funded that acquisition, and then respond appropriately depending on that date. The excess real property plan is something that applies only to property acquired prior to the uniform guidance. So, and that's only if the property is excess, in which case you need to have an excess real property inventory and submit that. For any property acquired after the effective date, the new requirement is a real property inventory and an annual report to FTA. So if you look at the first question in satisfactory continuing control in the contractor manual, you'll see that the indicator of compliance lists all the required elements of that real property inventory. That's what we're asking for in that case. We'll want to see your incidental use agreements. If you have any FTA funded facilities that have incidental use, meaning non-transit use, such as a coffee shop in a transit center or a newsstand or something like that, a parking that's not transit related, we want to see your agreement on the incidental use. We also are interested in a listing of any facilities that are planned to be constructed or renovated, so we can get information on the start date, the completion date, and the FTA portion of that. So all of those questions are germane to real property, real estate, land, fixed land, and appurtenances, land and buildings. The next set of bullets under satisfactory continuing control apply to your equipment, meaning your tangible personal property with an acquisition or installation cost of at least $5,000. So what we're talking about there is your rolling stock, your service vehicles, your maintenance equipment. I want to emphasize that because recipients sometimes confuse the first set of questions and think we're asking about equipment and when was acquired, and it gets very confusing. So make sure you're straight on that. The first several bullets are your real property. The last group are for your equipment. For equipment, in the past, you might remember we asked for a sample of your equipment records. We're now asking for your equipment management procedures if they're written. If they're not written, then we'll have a discussion about the topics for how you manage your equipment. And as a follow-up, we'll still ask to see your equipment records because all of those items are still required and they're addressed in the Contractor Manual. There's a table that lists the items that must be included on your equipment records. But particularly now, we kind of have more of a catch-all because recipients do have written equipment management procedures in a lot of cases, and that might answer all of those questions. We want to see documentation of your last physical inventory and the reconciliation of the inventory. So the inventory is when you physically check off that all the items on your equipment records are still in place and in transit use, and you verify their condition. The reconciliation means that you document in some way the change from the prior inventory. So you identify what's been added, what's been deleted, and what your final equipment listing is. That's what we mean by reconciliation. Typically, it's a memo to the file. It can be a sign-off, whatever your internal procedure is, but there's often questions about what reconciliation means, and it's a documentation of the change. We ask for a list of your vehicles, and we've mentioned a couple times the number of vehicles that you identify in the recipient profile should be consistent with what's on this list. It's not unusual for us to end up with confusing numbers, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how many vehicles you have. So make sure that information is consistent and identify if they're active, inactive, federally funded, locally funded. Make sure it's consistent with what's reported in the front part of the RIR. And we'll also discuss any disposition, what your procedures are for disposition if you've properly followed FTA requirements in removing vehicles or equipment from service. If you have a contingency fleet, if you have rolling stock that has exceeded its useful life, but you're holding it for contingency purposes, meaning emergency evacuation or some type of other transportation issue that would require you to add more vehicles, then we want to see documentation of how you used the contingency fleet, how it was deployed, and if it was consistent with what's in your contingency plan. If you're a rail provider, we want to see your rail fleet management plan. Like the TAM plan, we're not evaluating that, but we will be checking to see that it includes all the required elements. Lease agreements with any private operators, if applicable, to make sure they include all the required elements. And a warranty recovery system, if that's separate from your maintenance plan. And John's going to talk about that in maintenance. We have one question here we want you to answer with the RIR. It's asking if you have any federally funded facility, or if you plan to acquire a facility that's in a FEMA-defined flood hazard area. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has a website. You can go to the website, put in the address of the facility or the real property, and it will identify the flood hazard zone for that area. Increasingly, we're finding that in some coastal areas and other parts of the country where there have been climate change issues, real estate property that previously had no flood issues is now being reclassified by FEMA as being in a flood zone. And if that's the case, then you have to have flood insurance for anything that's federally funded. So as reviewers, we're going to be using all those addresses you give us for your facilities and checking on the flood status. Do that yourself, get ahead. Don't let us be the ones to tell you that you are short of flood insurance. So a couple of notes, again, distinguish between real property and the equipment, and make sure all the information in this area is consistent with what's in your grantee profile and also your fleet status report in TRAMS. That should be kept up to date. John's going to take us through maintenance now.
Thank you, Nancy. Maintenance, trying to get as close to operations as any of the review areas is maintenance. Pretty simple. What we're requesting now is what we requested 3 years ago, and that are plans. Right now we're talking about vehicles, major equipment, and facilities that have an FTA interest have to have maintenance plans. The requirements of those plans are relatively simple in terms of need to be up to date. So for example, your vehicle fleet, all different types of vehicles need to be reflected in your maintenance plan, different types of propulsion systems. So it has to reflect your current fleet. All major pieces of equipment should be included in a maintenance document, whether a vehicle or its own plan. We're talking major pieces of equipment, lifts, either portables or permanent, hoists, bus washers. I find that that's one area that's sometimes overlooked, are major pieces of equipment and the need for maintenance plans of that, because we do look at maintenance records at the site visits for major pieces of equipment. And then for each of your FTA funded facilities, whether they be operations, passenger stations, et cetera, you need to have maintenance plans for those as well. The bare minimum for the maintenance plans, up to date, set of maintenance activities and time periods associated with those activities. And if you look at the Contractor's Manual, you will see there's some recommendations for other items as well, which we'll talk about in a second. So submit your plans. Based on those plans, we'll be looking to see implementation of those plans when we get to the site visit in terms of looking at records. There's one question associated with that, and that is, has there been any, and this is new, has there been any instances of vehicles that have been out of service for an extended period of time, defined here as more than 2 weeks due to mechanical issues? This is a new area. It's just a yes or no, and the reviewer will follow up for either of your answers. So right now we're not looking for how many vehicles are out of service for how long, what mechanical issues, et cetera, but we're going to start the discussion of whether to see if there's an issue with vehicles being out of service due to mechanical issues. One thing I do want to clarify when we talk about facility maintenance plans, bus shelters should be included in those facility maintenance plans as well. Okay, but maybe they don't meet the strict requirement of facilities as talked about earlier, but there should be some maintenance plan, even if at a bare minimum inspection of your passenger shelters. Notes on maintenance plan, make sure the plans are up to date and consistent. Look at the contractor's manual to see what the minimum requirements and then what good practice dictates as well. So minimum requirements, set of activities and time frame associated with those activities, but also good practices to have goals and objectives, roles, responsibilities, talk about record keeping systems, warranty programs, etc. And you'll see in the manual as well some mission critical items that are identified for your facilities. These are the items for which we will look at maintenance records when we come on site.
And let's just remind everyone, you can use the question field on the screen if you have any questions to submit. As you submit your questions, we've got some help here compiling them, and we'll try to get answers and go through them at the end of the session.
Thank you. Thanks. I forgot to mention that, yes.
And I did too.
Ask questions of your reviewer throughout this whole process, but as part of this webinar as well. Procurement. Here's the usual suspect. Every year, the majority of the findings for these reviews are in the procurement area. It's a difficult area. We all realize that. To be compliant with federal requirements, each procurement's different. Each procurement has its own set of requirements. First thing we ask for is a list of your FTA funded procurement since the last review, as I said, and that would be since the end of the last site visit in 2017. Have a list of that. There's the elements for each procurement are listed in front of you. I'll just note that especially important are dollar values, type, method. This helps us identify the procurements that we're going to be reviewing on site. Change orders, what I would do is list each change order individually over 100,000. If you have a project with many change orders, some summary of that. Talk about that in a second. Put this in spreadsheet format so the reviewer can easily see what your procurements have been since the last review, again for identification purposes, to see if there's any non-competitive procurements, if you've had any construction, rolling stock, ITS projects, those sorts of things. Now, as part of our review, we may be looking at procurements that are prior to the review period if they've extended into the review period. Multi-year construction projects, one example. Rolling stock procurements where the vehicles were not delivered until the review period. We'll probably want to look at, we'll want to look at if you've complied with the post-delivery requirements in terms of Buy America, purchasers requirements, thank you, Nancy, and FMVSS. So normally, that's the time period, but it may extend to procurements that were initially executed prior to the review period. That's also true of rolling stock procurements where there's an option that's been awarded during the review period. Here are the other document requests for procurement. I'll highlight the first one, current policies and procedures. Go to the Contractor's Manual. You'll see a table there, very good table that summarizes what needs to be at a bare minimum in your policies and procedures. And like all documents, if you find by looking at that your policies and procedures need to be updated, submit your current ones, and then in the comment column, explain that you're updating your policies and procedures. Don't wait until the reviewer gets back to you to tell you that you need to revise them. Again, get a jump start on that. Standards of conduct, your policies for that, for both officers and employees, submit that. Protest, your procedures. Have you had protests since the last review? List those. List of capital leases, revenue contracts, and claims. Notes, we can get procurement procedures that are voluminous. If you have those, identify where the various elements are that the reviewer will need to confirm. Put that information either again in a document, a separate document, or in the comments column so they can easily search for that information if the document is not searchable. Help your reviewer. It's a team, you know, as we like to say, user, recipient, FTA, and us as reviewers as well. In terms of change orders, individually report all change orders over 100,000 like you do for your milestone progress reports. But if you have a multi-year, big new start, small start project with a voluminous number of change orders, just summarize those change orders in terms of numbers, total value, dollar value, or impact on schedule. And then that'll give him the information for the reviewer to follow up if more information is needed about change orders. Okay, I'll turn it back to Nancy for disadvantaged business enterprise.
Okay, DBE. DBE is the first of several civil rights areas that we're going to go through in the next sequence here. The first thing I want to mention is your DBE program, actually your Title VI program, your EEO program, all of the civil rights programs should be uploaded in TRAMS. But if they're not, then we want you to submit with the RIR the most recent DBE program. So if for some reason you've recently updated or made a change, we want to make sure we're looking at your current program. But in general, I mean, the FTA requires those to be submitted, so that should be on TRAMS. We're looking at your organization chart and your DBELO job description to make sure that the DBELO, the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Liaison Officer, has the right reporting relationship and authority for the DBE program. As John mentioned, this is a key area where we want you to show us what you've done. So we're looking for evidence of implementation for your small business element as described in your DBE program. The key thing here is whatever in your program is what you should be doing. So if you've got a lot of things in your program, if you've got a boilerplate program that really doesn't apply or indicate your actual actions, then we're going to have some problems. So make sure your program reflects what you're really doing. And then we want to see evidence of that. If you are a recipient that did not achieve your DBE goals in any year of the triennial review period, and you know that when you complete your uniform report on December 1st of every year for the prior fiscal year, then you're required to submit a shortfall analysis. The top 50 transit systems, so the big systems, are required to submit that shortfall analysis to FTA. But if you're not a top 50 system, if you're a smaller municipal system, then those analyses should be kept on file and we review them as part of the triennial review. Look in the contractor manual and determine if your shortfall analysis meets the requirements. There's specific elements that need to be included there. I see a lot of shortfall analyses that are just one page saying, sorry, didn't work out this year. We didn't implement, we didn't award what we thought we were. There's a whole lot more to it. And so do a good job. They're due December 29th. You still have time to do a good job if you haven't done one yet. We also want a list of any DBEs terminated or substituted on a project to ensure that those terminations or substitutions complied with the requirements, that you were properly notified and you approved those. Title VI, very similar. We want to make sure your Title VI program is up to date, that we're looking at the one you're currently implementing. It should be on trams. We will be looking at your lawsuits and complaints that have occurred since the last program submission. So that several of these bullets here are asking for information since your last Title VI program submission. If your submission was very recent, then we will look at the descriptions for the lawsuits, the complaints, facilities constructed, any fare increases, any service changes. So we'll look at your documentation in the Title VI program. But it's a 4-year period that's covered. So if you submitted it several years ago, then we want to see a listing of all of that applicable information since you submitted your last program to ensure that you complied with the requirements. So these items have specific applicability. The service and fare equity analyses requirements apply only to recipients with more than 50 fixed route vehicles in peak service in urbanized areas over 200,000. Look at the applicability, look at the contractor's manual for each of these questions, determine if you're required to have included that information, and if it's been a while since your Title VI program was submitted, then that's what we want you to submit with the RIR. The third bullet here applies only to states and MPOs. That is germane to subrecipient applications during the period. So if you're not a state or MPO, then you don't have to worry about that. So just to reiterate that we're asking for fare increases, fare and service equity analyses, complaints, lawsuits. Since you submitted your last Title VI update, don't send information that's already in the plan. And then a great deal of what we'll do in Title VI will be on site in terms of discussing your language assistance and your limited English proficiency activities. But those are things that should be in the program. You don't need to submit anything in addition there. Okay, John's going to take us through ADA now. There's 2 ADA sections.
Thank you, Nancy. 3 years ago, there was only 1 ADA section, and FTA appropriately split them up because some requirements deal with your entire system. Some are specific to your complementary paratransit service. So the first one is ADA general. And let me start off by saying, understand that ADA is the law of the land, and it applies to your entire system, all your services, whether there's FTA funds involved in either the asset or the operation, ADA still applies. And this goes back to earlier when we said operations program. Tell us what's locally funded, tell us what's FTA funded. Why do we need to know about locally funded? Because the ADA requirements, one of the reasons, is the ADA requirements apply to that aspect of your operation as well, even though there's not a direct federal interest in it, okay? But there's an ADA interest in everything, so be aware of that. I won't go through every bullet that's on the slide that you're looking at right now, but understand there's an increased emphasis by FTA on your complaint process. Make sure it is compliant with the regulations. We will be looking at your website in great detail, especially in the ADA portions of your website, to make sure that it is compliant and that the ADA information about complaints is easily accessible. An example of easily accessible would be 2 clicks before your main web page to be able to get to how do I file a complaint related to my disability. So make sure that's that. The other thing is make sure all your information is compliant, is consistent, that your written policies and procedures and information you give to your to the public are consistent with what's on the website as well. Service, we asked for, as we did 3 years ago, about handbooks, training materials in terms of the ADA aspect of your operation. Reasonable modification, that should be on the website, but understand that it applies to your entire system, all your services, not just complimentary paratransit, but some method that the disabled can request a modification to your services or policies or benefits in order to help them utilize your service. We talk about monitoring materials as well, surveys, checklists. That's related to the ADA service provisions, such as calling out stops, stops that have multiple routes that use those stops, how the visually impaired can navigate through those stops, your policies and procedures on service animals, et cetera, et cetera. Service to respirators, how lift availability and operation. All those service provisions that have been around for a while, we'll want to know what your policies and procedures are. And we'll also want to know how do you monitor them, that those policies and procedures are being implemented by your operators. And are you training your operators to implement those policies and procedures? So whatever information you can give to show that you're implementing those service provisions that are required under the ADA law would be helpful to your reviewer. There are 2 questions here that deal with facilities that have either been constructed or rehabbed that were not made accessible. If you have any, we ask about the disproportionate alteration costs in proportion to the overall cost and scope as well. This we've been asking for a while. Okay, the second ADA area is complementary paratransit. Again, make sure all your materials are consistent. So especially we've seen issues with paratransit riders guide that are outdated, that have information that is inconsistent with what's on the website. So again, as anything else, if you find that to be the case, submit what you have, start to update that information. The other items on this screen were asked for 3 years ago. I do want to mention about operational data. This is data on trip denials, on-time performance, missed trips, and excessively long trips. Service data, which indicates to you and to FTA whether you have adequate capacity to provide for the demand in your area, and that there's no pattern or practice of limiting the availability of complimentary paratransit service. So you should be collecting data similar to these items in order to be monitoring your ADA service and that it's meeting the ADA requirement, the demand in your area. Also, we ask if you have any other operators that are providing all or part of your ADA complimentary paratransit service. We'd like to look at those contracts. That could be taxi companies, transportation network companies. And if you have any such other providers of ADA complimentary service, how are you monitoring that service to make sure it complies with the ADA requirements? What are your oversight tools for those other operators to make sure they're providing compliant service? They are standing in your shoes, and you have to make sure that they're wearing those shoes correctly. 3 questions. This is new for complimentary paratransit. This gets at the point of making sure there's no pattern of practice of capacity constraints. So how do you collect operations data? By paper, Excel, some other commercial software? Do you monitor your paratransit service capacity? And if not, why not? So that goes back to those measures I talked about before in terms of denials, late trips, missed trips, and excessively long trips. That's the type of information you need to determine that there's no capacity constraints in your ADA paratransit service. Notes, and make sure, as I said before, everything is up to date, everything is consistent. With your oversight tools, submit examples of implementation, as Nancy talked about in the other areas, and any corrective actions or adjustments to your service that have been made. Question number 4. This is the first webinar associated with Triennial reviews in terms of, I guess it is the first webinar,
First
right?
live one.
Yeah, the first live one for RIR, but obviously that's just a small piece of this overall process. What other subjects or topics you'd like to see covered in a webinar similar to this one? How to avoid common findings. Procurement is always a big issue. ADA is always a, there's always concerns and questions about ADA, DBE, or any other topical areas as well. So take a few seconds and answer that, and we'll be right back. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back. I'm going to talk about Equal Employment Opportunity, EEO. You'll see we have a lot of bullets here. We're looking for a lot of required documents because, once again, we want to see evidence that you're implementing your EEO program, which should be uploaded to TRAMS. We ask you for your number of transit-related employees because the applicability of the EEO requirements depends on the number of transit-related employees you have as well as your amount of federal funding. So the Contractor's Manual spells out really clearly what these different thresholds are. Make sure that your plan is the appropriate plan for where you hit those thresholds. And sometimes we see that things have changed. Since you submitted your last program, maybe you've gotten an increase in federal dollars or an increase of employees. So your next EEO program might be under a higher threshold. Go and make sure you're aware of that and double check. We want to make sure that that you are properly disseminating the EEO program, that there are meetings between your EEO officer and other senior employees to discuss EEO issues, that you are including EEO in your performance evaluations, that you're completing the employment practices chart if it's required, and doing your utilization analyses. All of these things are part of your program, and we need to see documentation that you are implementing them. We end up making a lot of findings here because people have just boilerplate programs and they're not actually implementing all of the required elements. We want to know how you're managing complaints, internal complaints and external complaints, so we need a log of that. And if you have subrecipients or contractors that are above those EEO thresholds, then you as the primary recipient should be requiring EEO programs of your subrecipients and contractors and reviewing them for compliance. So again, a lot of items here that are requested. Everything is carefully explained in the Contractor's Manual. Take a look at the indicators of compliance there. I'm actually going to skip ahead because I want you to look at the example of the table. This is from the Draft Contractor's Manual in page 14.7 and 14.8. There's several pages of tables like this that identify every element that should be in your program, and then we'll need to see documentation that it's been implemented or not and why. So we always recommend that you do a self-check. Look at these tables, look at your program, and make sure you're prepared when we come on site with all the information. Then I'll just go back to the tips. Again, the information should be consistent with what's in your plan. So what you give us should reflect what your plan says you're doing. And the Contractor's Manual can be a huge help here. and double check the number of persons you have and also your federal dollars to make sure you're completing the proper plan. It may be an abbreviated plan, or maybe you're required to do the full plan going forward. All right. School bus, we usually can get through this pretty quickly. It's just most recipients just say no, they're not providing any school service and they're not providing any school tripper service. That's the question. Are you providing service that's been modified to accommodate the needs of school students or school personnel? That's what we call tripper service. So if you're adding a couple of extra trips in the morning and the evening around school hours, then those are trippers. If you're providing tripper service, we need to see documentation that it complies with the requirements, that the service is open to the public, it's noted on your schedules, that they stops at regular stops, anyone can board. We don't make a lot of findings here, but we will want to see that you are complying with that tripper requirement if you are providing that service. And it should be on your website, on your maps. That's where we sometimes see issues that the evidence isn't open to the public. The service is not properly advertised as open to the public. Charter bus. Charter is a big area because there's a lot of regulations that are required here, but increasingly we're not spending a lot of time within the triennial review because fewer and fewer recipients are providing charter service. But if you are providing charter service, then you need to be able to document for us that the service complies with the exceptions. The Contractor's Manual has a lot of really detailed information on defining what is charter service and what are the allowable exceptions and what documentation is required, what notification is required. There are tables that identify the specific exceptions and the specific notification and record-keeping requirements. So use the manual to double check that any of your service that might meet the definition of charter complies with those exceptions, and be prepared to work with your reviewer to get that information and be able to demonstrate that you're in compliance. You're also required to submit quarterly reports on FTA's charter website. So if you've been providing any charter service at all, double check that those quarterly reports have been submitted. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about quickly here is the Drug-Free Workplace Act, and then John will take it up with the Drug and Alcohol Program. These areas used to be together, but it's another situation where, in this case, they've been split apart. The Drug-Free Workplace Act policy is the first thing we ask for. We want to check to make sure it includes all the required elements. They're spelled out in the Contractor Manual. In a lot of cases, we see the drug-free workplace policy is now incorporated in your drug and alcohol testing policy, and that's perfectly fine as long as it's distinguished and we can see that it includes all the required elements. They're spelled out in the manual. We're looking for examples of your drug-free awareness program. You're required to have an ongoing drug-free awareness program. What we usually typically see there are notices from your employee assistance provider, posters on bulletin boards, information that may be on your intranet, just notification that you are a drug-free workplace, and then ongoing awareness of the effects of drug abuse on employees and how they can get help if necessary. And if you have an employee who had a drug statute conviction for a violation in the workplace, and I always say in all my years of doing this, I have never once had anybody say yes, they've had an employee with such a conviction, and I hope that continues to be the case. But if you have, we need to know the number of those employees, and we'll have a conversation about that during the site visit. So let's go on to the drug and alcohol program now.
We have never seen an instance where someone meets that criteria. Drug and alcohol, similar to what we've asked for 3 years ago, a couple of things I want to mention. First, a copy of the board adopted drug and alcohol policy. Make sure it's current and reflects the latest changes. Since 2017, there's been changes in the random testing rate for drugs, the substances to be tested, and also some of the cutoff thresholds. So make sure your policy is compliant with the latest. If those items are mentioned in your policy procedures, make sure they're correct. And again, if not, start to change them. We asked before about supervisors that are required to make reasonable suspicion determination, but now we're asking for Information also about covered employees, both in the training programs. What are your training programs for covered employees as well as supervisors? And give us a list of covered employees that have been placed in safety-sensitive positions since the last review, as well as new supervisors and other officials. So that's a little bit broadening the review parameters in drug and alcohol program. The certifications for your vendors or service agents, such as your medical review officers, substance abuse professionals, breath alcohol technicians, submit those as well. Make sure they're active right as the time you've submitted them or current. There's normally a 3 or 5 year time frame for those certifications. Make sure they're valid and up to date when they're submitted to you as well. So the rest of this area is very similar to 2017 questions and document requests. Section 5307 program. Now we talked a lot about splitting up review areas. Here we combined them. So 3 years ago there was a review area for planning and program projects. There was a separate one for fare and service changes and another separate one for half fare eligibility. They've all been combined into one review area. Section 5307 program requirements. You can see the bullets in front of you are similar to what we asked for 3 years ago. I just want to highlight on the fare and service change policy. It can be the same as the one you have that's required under the Title VI program. If it is, just note that and just make sure it defines what's a major service reduction, as well as it includes a public comment process. So just a little hint there. I have some good news on the next slide, which we'll talk about right now. The first 2 items have to do with your program of projects or using the MPO process to meet those requirements. We've asked about that before, but recently and since the issuance of the RIR, the information that we used to collect on transit security expenditures and associated transportation improvements is no longer required to be submitted. So this is hot off the press, if I can use an old term, hot off the web now, terminology. You no longer need to collect this data and submit it to FTA. The requirement is still there to expend 1% and meet the associated transportation improvements requirements for those programs. But you do not need to submit that information as part of your RIR submission. So if you're not the point of contact for your Triennial review, make sure they know this change, and you can see that the split letter is no longer needed to be submitted, or information on security expenditures, either amount of funds or types of projects. So there's some good news there. And you know, the associated 2 questions that were in last year's manual have now been taken out as well. I like that. That's sort of a cross saying it's going away. So there's no longer an exhibit 19.1, but as Nancy has reminded me earlier, those requirements still remain. Notes similar to what before, use web links for your MPO documents, your public participation plan, your transportation improvement plan, planning certification review, any other documents. Don't submit them. Web links are sufficient. 5307, the last one. Now this talks about those. One thing you should be informing your reviewer, either part of the operations profile or in this section, is whether you're a recipient of 5310 funds, either a designated and or direct recipient, because this area only applies to states and 5310 designated recipients. So in an urbanized area, the designated recipient can be different than the direct recipient. If you're only the direct recipient, these are requirements and document requests do not apply. I would say, though, that if it does apply, submit your latest public transit, human services transportation plan as part of the RIR if the latest is not already uploaded into TRAN. And so those 4 bullet points talks about documents that we were requested during the last review. A recap of the tips: Make sure all the information you submitted 3 years ago has been updated, and use some of the information. You can use some of the information you submitted before is still current. And those bullet points I think we've touched on. Okay, so what happens after this? FTA and the contractor will get together after you've submitted the RIR and that information has been reviewed to determine if you need any extra special love in terms of an enhanced review. You'll be notified if that's the case. A minimum of 10 days before the site visit, hopefully longer, you will get what's called a site visit agenda package that will list any additional questions we have, documents to be submitted, and will identify some of the records we'll look at the site, especially in terms of the echo records, maintenance records, and procurement records. However, you should be in constant contact with your reviewer from the date of the submission of the RIR, well, from now to then, but all the way through to the site visit, which normally lasts a minimum of 2 days, consists of interviews, tours, okay, and visits to any subrecipients. When you get the agenda package, responses are appreciated. It makes the site visit even smoother. The more information you can give your reviewer before they're there on site. The last question, do you find this webinar useful? 1 to 5 scale. Yes, definitely on the first one, and not so much on number 5. So take a second and do that. And then we'll talk a little bit about follow-up and questions that we've received during this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take a few minutes now. We got a lot of good questions from the audience. We'll read the question and then we've got an answer for you. And if there's some that we don't have complete answers, that will be included in the transcript when it's made available. And if you have any additional questions now, go ahead and still send them in. We still have almost about 30 minutes to get through these. The first question is, if we are part of a group plan for TAM, what is it you're looking for from the recipient? So I want to clarify, if you are a part of the group plan because you're a subrecipient, then as the triennial review, we're not going to be expecting anything from you other than documentation which should have been provided to the primary recipient. So if you're the subrecipient and you're a 5307 subrecipient of some sort, you're directly getting funds, but you're still part of a group plan, then all of the questions really apply to the sponsor. So I hope that answers the question. And we'll, if that's not what you were asking, follow up and we can get more information.
Second question is the ADA area about route deviated systems. What information do we need to supply submitted for that, for those types of services and systems? And route deviated service you can use as a substitute for complementary power transit service as long as it's open to the public and publicized as open to the public. So that's the information we're going to want to see. And send us to the website description of the service or any printed brochures or other information that you provide on your service to confirm that it's open to the public and that the public is aware that anyone can ride it, not just those who are disabled. Okay. In addition, the reviewers will want to confirm that the service to disabled persons is equivalent to the service that is provided to non-disabled persons. Equivalent service is provided to all the public.
And that's in terms of response time, the fare, all of the service elements for equivalent service need to be applicable in both cases.
Right. Your reviewer, you will want to have a discussion with your reviewer on how you operate your route deviated service.
Okay. The next question, if we don't meet the threshold that requires us to have an EEO plan, but we have a contractor who does, what information should we provide? So if your contractor is required to have a plan, either an abbreviated plan or a full plan, we want to confirm that you have required that plan, received the plan from the contractor, and you're conducting proper oversight. So that means you collect the plan, you review the plan, you make sure it includes all the required elements, and it's being implemented. So that it would be part of the oversight for your contractor, that the reviewers will be looking for implementation of your oversight in all these areas. Specifically in EEO, we'll be looking for your oversight that you've collected the plan and that the contractor is implementing it. And whatever oversight mechanisms you set up, we'll need to see documentation that you're following that process. You have some more?
Yeah, you mind if I answer a charter one?
Go ahead.
Okay, so the question is, we do not provide charter service in a particular quarter. Do we still need to submit a report? No, you only need to submit a report for the quarters in which you operate charter service. The next one, Dan?
I'll get next one. You want to do the next one? It's maintenance, right?
It's sort of satisfactory continued control.
Okay.
If you have equipment that was not originally FTA funded, but we used FTA funds to maintain it, do you want a listing of the equipment or parts that we purchased with FTA funding? If it's locally funded and you've only used FTA funds for minor parts and labor, it does not have to be included in your inventory. You want to expand that, Nancy, at all?
Yeah, I mean, the equipment definition is only anything that equals the $5,000 cost. So if it's below that cost, that would not be considered equipment.
I'll answer the next one. Okay, I'll answer the next one. We are a recipient of FDA funds, but we have a contractor who operates our transit service. For Drug-Free Workplace Act and for Drug and Alcohol Program, what information do we need to provide to the reviewers? For Drug-Free Workplace, the policy and the Drug-Free Workplace Program, those requirements are on you only. Do not pass through to any subrecipients or contractors. So you need to supply that information for your agency only. Now for drug and alcohol, you need to show that the drug and alcohol program being implemented by your contractor is compliant. So you would need to obtain from them a copy of their drug and alcohol program and monitor implementation of the program. So I would recommend submit their plan and program and any oversight tools and either procedures and or evidence of implementation of you monitoring your contractor to make sure their drug and alcohol program is compliant.
If a document is in TRAMS, do we prefer a web link or a copy of the document to be uploaded to the RIR? That's something you should discuss with your reviewer because it may vary from reviewers. Either way is acceptable, but for all of these types of questions, talk to your reviewer, find out how the reviewer wants you to submit and upload documents. I mean, I personally would prefer just notification that it's in TRAMS because I go into TRAMS and pull these out myself. But other reviewers, may prefer it be loaded into the Dropbox. So definitely check with your reviewer on a preference for that. Okay, in financial management and capacity, resumes. Are you asking for detailed resumes from all employees that work with applications, award closeouts, etc.? As a state DOT, that could be as many as 10. I've had this question from some of my recipients, and again, I would say check with your reviewer. What I said is I don't necessarily need to see detailed resumes. It's acceptable for me if we just get a list of employees and credentials, more similar to the table that was in the last RIR. But again, John, what would be your response if your recipients asked you that?
My response, we were more concerned about the supervisors and those who are ultimately responsible for the financial management compliance. We don't need resumes of everyone.
Right, exactly. And then the point is we want to see that the supervisors in their job descriptions have the correct span of authority, and that, so, you know, it may say the senior financial manager is responsible for supervising the lead accountant, and the lead accountant is responsible for supervising the accounting clerk, something like that, and the financial manager needs to have you know, a degree in accounting or, you know, equivalent service experience, something. So that's what we're looking for. I don't need to see multi-page resumes from everybody where they went to school and, you know, every job they've had.
No. A procurement item that I should have mentioned, because we got the same question on a previous webinar, is what's the threshold for reporting FTA-funded procurements? We'd like to see everything individually listed over the micro procurement threshold, which has recently been increased to $10,000. Now, you will want to talk to your reviewer to see if they have any interest in looking at any micro purchases. They may want to pull one when they're at the site visit. But for this list of procurements, anything over the micro purchase threshold of $10,000.
We have a question here about TAM, and I'm not exactly sure what's being asked. It says distinguish between state DOT and recipient for TAM plan. I would say there's a lot of information about TAM, who's responsible, who needs to report, what needs to be reported on the FTA website. So I don't know exactly what's being asked here, but any questions about TAM, you should go to the FTA website, look at the FAQs. There's more than in a lot of other areas, FTA has provided a great deal of really detailed information there. So if whatever you're looking for isn't answered on that TAM website, you know, follow up with FTA. Ms. Shadoni Smith's contact information is there. She's the lead person at FTA headquarters for TAM, and that's probably the best source of information.
The FTA website has a tremendous resource of technical assistance and information, and as frequently asked questions as well that Nancy had mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of resources out there on the FTA website to help you through this requirement.
And the TAM questions, the FAQs are updated periodically. There was just a recent update, I think it was November 19th, or really recently, the last time I was on there. So they're continually adding additional information. For the triennial review, as I said, we're really not evaluating anything. We're just looking to make sure that you've complied with what's required. And this webinar is not for states. We're just dealing with the 5307 recipients. So I don't really want to speculate more about what would be required for the states at this point.
No, but if you feel we've not addressed it, or you have a more specific concern, still submit it and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, we can include it in the written transcript with the answers.
We will answer all your questions.
At some point.
Thank you. At some point. May not be us, but our experts behind the scenes will.
I think we've got one more coming in.
One more coming in? Thank you for your questions, by the way.
These are great questions. Yeah, I kind of feel like I'm on a PBS you know, pledge drive, things coming in. Oh yeah, confirm it's okay to use the draft contractor's manual over the 19 manual. Yes, please use the draft FY 2020 manual, because there are changes. You know, we mentioned the security expenditures
question.
gone. Yeah, and the security and the associated transit improvement questions were in the 2019 manual. There's other changes, and those will be highlighted at your workshops going forward. So if you haven't signed up for a workshop, definitely try to get a workshop in December or January, and when we're teaching the workshops, we'll go through more of the changes in the contractor's manual.
But use the 20 manual, do not use the 19 manual.
Yeah, I mean, I know we were just giving a link to the 19 manual until we got our first draft of the 20, but we've had several, I think it's up to the third version of the 20 draft, so that's the one you should be using now, the one that's on this webinar that you can download.
And when the final is produced and put on the FTA website, FTA will have an email blast to inform you of that.
Any other questions? No? Okay, so again, if you have any further questions that, still you can submit them for a moment until we cut off the webinar. But after that, contact your FTA regional office or your lead reviewer from the contractor team that's doing your review. Information for the regional office contacts are on the FTA website, so there's a link there. Recordings and transcripts will be made available. We just don't have the access link for that yet, but when we know exactly where the transcripts will be housed, we'll notify everybody who's registered, and then you can get that information. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for attending and participating in your questions. And there will be a survey following the webinar about your experience. So please take a couple moments and fill that out as well so we can improve this whole area of technical assistance in the Triennial review field. Thank you.
Thank you. Good holidays to everyone.
Yeah, happy holiday.